everyone. Welcome to the first seminar in our new premises. So the first seminar, the first African Study Center seminar in the Herta Moore building, which coincides with the last seminar that Rick is facilitating as a communications officer at the African Study Center. So thank you very much, Rick, for making it work again and for all the years of making it work. Thanks very much. My name is Marlijn Necker. I'm the director of the African Study Center, and I will be facilitating this afternoon session. And I'm really happy that we have Tanja Hendriks, Dr. Tanja Hendriks, here to share her work on Malawi with us. And Tanja has a long history at the Africa Study Center. She did her research master here, after and lots of other things too, but also a research master involved in several research projects. Then moved to Edinburgh for her PhD work on Malawi. After Edinburgh, moved to Leuven, where she's currently doing a postdoc, building on her PhD work. And I'm sure what you will present to us today will be a combination of both. Exactly. So very happy to have Tanja here. I also saw that we have some online participants. Ivan, welcome. Tanja will speak for about 35-40 minutes, and then we open up the floor for discussions and questions. Tanja, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay, so I have to do the scary thing first and share the screen. Let's see if this is going to work. Share. I hope this now. Okay, immediate assistance needed. Thank you, Rick. Either way, it's lovely to see all of you here. I will be presenting a bit of a mix between my PhD work and my current postdoc. And yeah, it's lovely to be back home in a way, so it feels a bit like a warm welcome back, which is always nice, I guess, at the start of a semester. The talk is based on a mix of my PhD and my postdoc, and I submitted the manuscript that I'm basically presenting today to the publisher last Friday, so it's all very fresh, and I'm very much looking forward to some comments. And in short, I think I can say that the talk will be about the role of the state in contexts and situations where it initially appears incompetent, irrelevant, and ill-equipped, or perhaps even invisible, so it doesn't appear at all. And over the course of it, I will try to unpack the conundrum of how a state can be insignificant and indispensable at the same time. In doing so, I can challenge and complicate both popular and academic understandings of African civil servants, African states, and African state functioning. And ultimately, so this can be kept at the back of your mind, ultimately, this will lead me to argue that studying disaster relief interventions actually throws the state itself into relief and renders visible civil servants' sense of duty, but also what this is up against. So that's where we're going to be going. So let me start in good anthropological fashion by taking you to the field. So we returned to very early March 2019 to a rural district in southern Malawi. It was still raining ever so slightly when Joseph pulled up in his car to pick me up. When I had moved into my new home in the district several days ago, he had kindly offered to drive me to his office whenever he was going for work. As the district's assistant disaster risk management officer, Joseph had been allocated a house a mere stone's throw away from the council offices, but he generally commuted to town in order to be able to spend time with his family. While he reversed his car in the muddy compound, Joseph explained that he'd been very much delayed because he kept receiving phone calls about the relentless rains that had started a few days ago. He was very worried because the district was located in a valley and always on the receiving end of every catastrophic event. So this was day one of field work. During our short drive to the district council offices, Joseph told me about the panicky phone calls he had received from his team of colleagues who were now stuck on the east bank of the river. They had traveled there yesterday to do food distributions as part of an annual humanitarian intervention to combat food insecurity, but they were now failing to make their way back to the main road. The area is only accessible via a dirt road that traverses several streams, which had now turned into full-blown impassable rivers. And Joseph really worried that these water levels would continue to be rising and that the team would be stuck for a long time. Later that same day, it became clear that Malawi was actually experiencing the effects of Cyclone Idai. And Joseph made a phone call to his bosses in Lilongwe, Malawi's capital, to inform them of the unfolding situation. And when I asked him after the phone call why he had made the call and what he expected to get out of it, maybe funds or extra assistance, he laughed, a genuine laugh. He was like, "Funds? Tanya, no, we won't get those." So over the course of my fieldwork, I basically learned that working without funds was actually at the core of Joseph's craft as a civil servant. When we arrived at the district office that day, we found ourselves in a strange kind of calm before the storm. Outside, the rains continued and water levels rose, while inside the office, it was much more the tension that was rising. It became almost tangible as Joseph sat behind his desk, troubled and restless, powerless to do anything other than wait for the inevitable reports about the impacts of the rains caused by Cyclone Idai. He made several calls to communities he thought likely to be affected, warning them about what might come, and he reminded people who called him to declare the first signs of disaster that he needed official reports as evidence to submit to his department, the Department of Disaster Management Affairs. Anticipating that the situation would worsen further, he also called a meeting of the District Civil Protection Committee, which would take place the following morning. The following morning, he again came to pick me up, and he exclaimed, "I've not slept. I've been on the phone the whole night." The imminent flooding was now the talk of the town, and rumor had it that the strong shear currents were destabilizing the bridge that connected the district to the rest of the country. Joseph invited me into his car, and I saw that he was now accompanied by his close friend Kundwani, who was also his assistant at the district council. Instead of driving straight to the office, we decided to check out the situation at the bridge first. And when we got there, we saw a really large crowd of people had already gathered. Quickly, Joseph and Kundwani grabbed what they jokingly referred to as their disaster equipment, gumboots and an umbrella, as you can see in this picture, gumboots and an umbrella, and we walked towards the bridge in the rain. So that's this picture. I felt utterly unprepared for the scenario that was unfolding before our eyes. In the rains that came with Cyclone Idai, the banks of the Shira River had burst, causing flooding as far as the eye could see. Kundwani was taking pictures of the tips of trees that you can see on the side, barely visible above the water in the distance. The road Joseph had driven on just yesterday to get to the district was now partly submerged. He was making more phone calls, and when he managed to get a call through to one of his bosses, he spoke fast, and I discerned a hint of panic in his voice. "We've been cut off. This is worse than the 2015 floods, and the whole district is affected." Yeah, so that's basically what happened in this picture. And this excerpt is based on my field notes. And after this incident, I spent another 12 months following Joseph on the left and Kundwani on the right, as they were combating the effects of Cyclone Idai and organizing the relief response after it. So Idai was one of the deadliest cyclones to have occurred in the Southern Hemisphere until date, only surpassed by Cyclone Freddy in 2023. It caused days of incessant rains, strong winds causing large-scale flooding, destruction and displacement, also in Mozambique and Zimbabwe, so Malawi's neighboring countries. And in Malawi, 60 people were killed, tens of thousands of people became internally displaced, and a total of more than 1 million people were directly affected, not in the least because their crops flooded, and they had been mere weeks away from harvesting. So this means, in a context like Malawi, that this type of shock easily leads to hunger and then necessitates follow-up interventions. As a response to this situation, the president declared a state of disaster in 15 out of Malawi's 28 districts. And this is basically a way to invite the international community to come in with additional humanitarian assistance. The word additional is really crucial here because the Malawi state and its citizens already profoundly depend on humanitarian and development aid, also outside this context of disasters. So about 40% of the country's budget is funded by the international community. So as a country, you could say, Malawi basically finds itself in a perfect storm. Malawi is very donor dependent, which means that collaborations between state and non-state actors are ordinary and normal and occur the year round. Which also leads to relatively negative perceptions of the state, as if the state is failing to take care of its citizens on its own, as if service delivery is not possible without outside assistance. And a lot of the development apparatus then gets this kind of image of the state actually being in the way, not as another partner in helping to reach people that they also want to reach, but as an institution that you have to navigate and that is cumbersome to kind of have to deal with. At the same time, Malawi is also really disaster prone. And I think the above brief vignette with which I started this talk kind of shows this donor dependency, but also the disaster proneness, because Joseph couldn't really do much once these water levels started rising. So yes, he is responsible for disaster management in this district, but what can he do other than go to his office and wait for official reports to come in? He's just one man noticing the rains, officially responsible, but not having any resources to be able to actually respond. So at first glance, this really resonates with some of the earlier scholarly debates and predictions that in the context of globalization and neoliberalism and increasingly global challenges like climate change, the influence and importance of states was diminishing, their power waning, their relevance declining, and that basically we would do away with the state somehow. However, as I will show in the rest of this talk, Joseph and his colleagues of the Department of Disaster Management Affairs, DODMA in short, I'll say DODMA many times, performed really crucial roles in the disaster relief interventions in response to Cyclone Idai. So despite the fact that Malawi is donor dependent and really disaster prone, most of the models that we have in global agreements, so we can think of the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, the sustainable development goals, all of these big global agreements have a kind of state plus responsibility idea. So the first responsibility to deal with disasters rests with the state. And if they fail to do this, they can declare a state of disaster or state of emergency and invite assistance. But the first point of contact is the state. So this is obviously a bit in tension with Malawi's situation. And this disaster proneness is only exacerbated by climate change effects. So even though the Malawi state lacks the capacity and resources to deal with disasters in its territory on its own, it remains central in efforts to provide relief. And I'll try and use the dilemmas, duties, and decisions of Joseph and Kondwani in this presentation to kind of show how this makes the state both insignificant and indispensable, so central and marginal at the same time. And unfortunately, these climate change effects are making things a lot worse for Malawi. Not just in 2019, when I conducted the research that much of this talk is based on, but we can basically see that in the last 10 years, Malawi declared a state of disaster 8 times, which is really unprecedented. In 2015, there was flooding, 2016, drought. 2019, we had Cyclone Idai and another cyclone, Cyclone Kenneth, in April. 2020 and 2021, the declaration of a state of disaster was because of COVID. 2022, Cyclone Anna and Cyclone Gombe. And 2023 and 2024, periods in which I conducted fieldwork, which is why I've put them in bold. They've been responding to Cyclone Freddy and an ongoing El Niño drought. And just to give you, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, so I don't get stuck on numbers very often, but just to give you a few numbers to kind of situate the magnitude of these disasters. Malawi's population is about 21 million people. And Cyclone Idai directly affected 1 million people. And at the same time, there was a food insecurity response ongoing, feeding 3.5 million people. But Cyclone Freddy, just a couple of years later, affected directly 2.2 million people, so that's more than double, while there was a food insecurity response feeding 3.8 million people ongoing. And currently, the drought has affected more than 9.6 million Malawians directly. So that's almost half of the population. And the annual food insecurity response that had already started before the declaration of the state of disaster targets 5.7 million people. So that's also almost double of 5 years ago. And we see this number going up. Obviously, there's all kinds of work being done on the Anthropocene and how we currently live in an era in which human influence on the environment is making things change, for some for the better, for some for the worse. And this actually brings me to a pet peeve that I really want to kind of focus on a little bit, namely that disasters are not natural, despite the fact that this type of terminology continues to be widely used. Not every flood or drought is a disaster. There are patterns of inequality and vulnerability that underlie the creation of disasters. So that basically means that things like a flood or a drought are natural hazards, And they only turn into a disaster when they meet a group of people that is vulnerable to their effects, that isn't able to withstand these type of disruptions. So disasters in and of themselves are not natural, and calling them natural actually naturalizes the fact that they occur. So that's why I'm objecting to this terminology. And for this, we can turn actually to the anthropology of disasters, because there are a lot of anthropologists who've said very smart things about this. Anthony Oliver Smith and Susanna Hoffman, for example, have said, in the most direct sense, the mutual construction of human beings and environments provides a theoretical basis for asserting that we construct our own disasters insofar as disasters occur in the environments that we produce. And environments here can be thought of very broadly, the economic environments, political environments, social environments. And yeah, speaking about disasters as natural, therefore naturalizes the way inequalities basically structure the world we live in. And we also know already since the early 90s, I'm quoting here Eric Wolf, who was a sociologist, who said, we owe to social anthropology the insight that the arrangements of a society become most visible when they are challenged by crisis. And again, Anthony Oliver Smith and Susanna Hoffman, who said, well, anthropologists actually should study disasters because disasters, no matter how large, are always experienced first at the local level. So we are actually really well situated to say something about why disasters are not natural and to show how they are part of evolving processes. So in this sense, studying how the state is instantiated in a time of disaster reveals its everyday functioning in a heightened fashion, magnifying dynamics that are always at play. And this underlines how disasters do not so much cause, but really reveal the rifts and the reasonings and the relationships that we study and try to understand to see what they can tell us about the world we live in. And it basically positions, and this is what I do in my own work as well, disasters as a problem and a challenge for people who experience them, but also for governance and for people who are in power, because the state is seen as the primary provider of safety and security for citizens. But if you are a state like the Malawi state, dependent on the international system to prop you up, there's obviously, challenges involved in this. And this also has to do with how we have thought and studied about states, not just in anthropology, but also more generally. So African states specifically have been, throughout the years in academia, but also in more popular understandings, been described as dysfunctional, corrupt, absent, invisible, clientelist, patrimonial, neo-patrimonial, basically very few positive adverbs there. And these kind of views are really interlinked with dominant development paradigms. So in the 1960s, many African countries obtained independence. In the 1970s, the whole development industry started focusing on basic needs, thinking that these African states were unable to feed or educate their citizens, so they were focusing on this. 1980s, we see a swing to the more neoliberal side of things, so the structural adjustment programs, the idea that the market would solve a lot of problems and that government should be small. And in the 1990s, there was a big turn towards the so-called crisis of governance, and this heralded the era of good governance. So the idea being that a lot of the approaches from the past had actually been correct, but that they had been wrongly implemented, or that the state, again, was in the way and messing things up somewhere in between the policy and the practice. Malawi actually fits this image quite well. It was one of the first countries in Southern Africa to accept a structural adjustment program. And there have been really high and alarming rates of high-level corruption. So corruption, not petty cases at the bottom of the chain, but high-level corruption in parliament and really at the top. For people who know Malawi or who've worked on Malawi, there's Cashgate in 2013, which was really a multi-million-dollar scandal. My former supervisor, Gerhard Anders, is working on a book, which should be coming out next year. Highly recommend reading that. There was Tractorgate in 2019, the Zunet Sattar case, which is currently in court in London. So lots of transnational linkages there. But again, I refer to the work of others. I'm not trying to say in the rest of this talk that corruption is not there or that it's not playing a role, but it's not what I focus on. There's other people who have and continue to work on that. So I'll now focus on how I've studied the state. And for this, I've taken a kind of course that was started really early on in anthropology. So it actually started off with Radcliffe Brown in the 1940s, who made a statement in saying that the state does not exist in the phenomenal world. It is a fiction of the philosophers. What does exist is an organization i.e. a collection of individual human beings connected by a complex system of relations. I think this is something that anthropology is obviously very good at, studying relations and what people do. Timothy Mitchell later proposed in the 80s or early 90s that the state should be thought of as a structural effect. So it shouldn't be examined as an actual structure out there independent of people or independent of us, but it's actually the powerful metaphysical effect of practices that make it appear as such, which sounds a bit agnostic, but the way we talk about the state also makes the state like that, right? This is basically where what I'm building on. And then I build on the work of Tess Leah, who has written on bureaucracies as peopled. So bureaucracy doesn't do anything on its own. In the end, it's a person pressing a button. It's a person making a decision, putting a stamp on something. And it's people who make the state work and function. And this is actually borrowed from Pia Schenk and Olivier de Satan, who published a book here in Leiden with Brill in 2014, States at Work, focusing on precisely this. So in my own work, I really focus on everyday practices of individual state bureaucrats and civil servants, the ones who basically represent and instantiate the state. So in my mind, they kind of marry the state imaginaries with actual empirical practices that we can observe. Now, a few words about DODMA specifically, because this means that I basically focus on one specific department. And in that department, I've chosen specific people that I studied. So here's another picture of Joseph at a food distribution. Joseph and Kondwani were the ones I focused on at district level in 2019. I spent 12 months basically shadowing them, following them around every day to the meetings that they were going to the trainings that they had. And then for my postdoc in 2023 and 2024, I've been following a group of 5 people at DODMA's national level, so based at the capital city, following them around in the same fashion, basically. And so this talk and all the ideas that you hear today are based on participant observation and a few interviews, but mainly the shadowing, the really sharing time and space. And DODMA is a bit of a strange department within the Malawi state structure. So they have a national disaster risk management structure. Every country has this and is obliged to have it. And within Malawi state structures, DODMA is a kind of golden goose. So unless a disaster takes place, it does not have access to any funding. It's not a ministry, it's a department, so it relies on funding from elsewhere. But when a disaster does happen, it's a prime source of resources for state structures throughout the country. So the department is really tightly controlled by the government of the day and the ruling party of the day. It is located in the capital city. It has about 120 people working for it. And in 2019, when I did my PhD, there were 11 district-based officers who were based in districts deemed to be disaster-prone. But now there's 28 district officers. So every district has one responsible person who's responsible without budget for, thousands of kilometers of land in which disasters can occur. And DODMA is the leading state agency during emergencies, crises, and disasters. And in a way is a kind of linchpin between short-term humanitarian interventions, but also the longer-term trajectory of development that the international community keeps trying to set Malawi on. So here I've put a little arrow. The District Civil Protection Committee, of which Joseph was the secretary, was what I focused on in my PhD. And during my postdoc, I've found myself a bit higher up in the governance scale or hierarchy. You see everything falls under the cabinet and the president, basically. And then there's NGOs who are very much involved into all kinds of technical committees that then make up the disaster structure that goes down all the way to the village. Basically, what I'll do in the last bit of this talk, or the second half, if you will, is look at 3 key elements of disaster governance that I suggest are also key elements of governance in Malawi outside this context of disasters. And they kind of emerged from my data during my PhD, but I've seen them confirmed, if you will, during my postdoc. So the first is the centrality of quantitative data in decision-making. The second, reliance on decentralized committees, and the third, collaborations with non-state actors. So the first, this need for disaster data is something that was really evident in the beginning of disaster relief interventions, and the other 2 are more related to the implementation of the relief interventions and recovery efforts that are then set up. So let me turn to the first one. Disaster data The first thing that happened after Joseph started receiving calls was that he needed official reports. He needed to help render this disaster governable, if you will. There was a need for information in order to be able to respond. He needed to know what was going on, but only to pass that information on to people who would have the resources to actually respond, or who could provide resources to him to then respond. And a central point of contention really was that these numbers were basically not yet existing. So they had to be produced, right? These bureaucratic facts have to be produced. And this is really, really hard work. So there's a shared demand for data. There's no baseline. Malawi does not have a population registry. There's no disaggregated data available. Chiefs are custodians of population data, if you will, but this is not necessarily archived on paper. So there's no way of knowing, really. I mean, you can guesstimate, but there's no way of actually knowing how many people live in which area, what has happened in that area currently with the flooding, and what would they need? Do they need blankets, or are they actually okay? Do they mainly need seeds because it's mainly maize that has flooded, or is it mainly houses? All this type of data was what NGOs also really wanted. So they kept calling Joseph to get information and data, and this data was not there. Also because none of the NGOs was making money available to create this data. So Joseph found himself in a double bind, the double bind of data deprivation. He didn't have the numbers to get the money, but he also didn't have the money to get the numbers. And so this then means that you're kind of stuck. And in trying to then create numbers, this means that he would sometimes create numbers, sometimes based on more or less empirical guesstimations, phone calls with people, based on experience, thinking, okay, in the 2015 floods, we had about 500 people affected in this area. Maybe we'll just put 500 and then we'll take it from there. And by many of the humanitarian partners, this was then somehow seen as corruption, or as something that was, to do with deflating or inflating figures. And this was very frustrating. So I have a brief ethnographic vignette here of how some of these numbers were created, which I think I will summarize slightly. Basically, I followed Joseph when we were going on disaster risk needs assessments. So after a disaster has happened, you need to send out teams to then go and assess the situation. And we went to one camp. So it's basically higher up areas where you see a group of people. So that's where you pull over with your car and then you inquire, who are you guys? Where have you come from? What is the situation like that side? Have you seen any water points that were affected? Will you be able to stay here for the night? What will you need? Can you come up with a name? Can you come up with a leader? You are now a displacement camp. Basically, that's how it goes. And so the man that we were speaking to was gesturing around and he said, we are 568 families in this camp. So Joseph wrote down 568. But then when we walked around, it seemed like a bit much and like they were actually less. So at some point they discussed and then they agreed there were 204 households. So instead of 568, Joseph wrote down 204 households. Subsequently, there was an NGO that wanted to assist with 75 households. So in another district list, this camp was listed as 75 households. And when we spoke to this same man a few weeks later, he was very, very angry. And he kept snorting, you gave us small numbers, you gave us small figures. Because they had not been able to update the list of numbers that had now been in the district database, which basically meant Joseph's notebook. So that was the district database. Recounting his story of how he was trying to visit the council offices to update this number, he accused the government of not caring, and he was visibly upset. And Joseph was also getting upset because this messed up his entire database. And the man kept getting all worked up. Then he said there was another INGO that came to support them, but they too rejected the number that he had compiled. He had made his own list and he showed it to us. It was a whole, just a massive list. It now included 1,175 households. So that's, a nearly tripling of what we had initially counted. So Joseph decided, okay, we have to go to this location and check. So we went there again and there were a lot of people and the chief just said, look, all these people are here. The people are present. You can take their fingerprints, you can do whatever you want. All these people need help. And he was very, very upset that Joseph then said that he could increase the number to 678. And I don't know where Joseph got 678. So I asked him, 678, how did you get to this? He was like, well, it's slightly more than the original 568, plus the 171 that we had at some point, and the 75 that this one other INGO did. So they, they discussed for a while, and then they said, okay, well, I can't, the chief literally said, I can't refuse. So he wasn't happy with the new number that they agreed upon, but he said, well, yeah, I mean, at least it means some assistance. So at the end, when I asked him, well, is there anything, can you say something about how many of your people are still in need now? He thought for a very long time, and then he said, so this means there is no real number. I can't put a number on this. And Joseph completely agreed. They shook hands. They still agreed on the latest number, but they both agreed that what had happened was, difficult to put into numbers, and they had now, compromised basically. And I think that vignette, but also much of the other data that will hopefully be in my book, will show that getting these numbers right, so getting the right disaster number, means very different things for very different people at very different times. So sometimes these numbers are an accurate reflection of an empirical reality you can count. Sometimes it's pragmatic, just to access funding. At other times, you're trying to live up to some kind of moral obligation, knowing that this, you want to make some assistance available, but you don't have enough, and this area is marginalized. So maybe if you do it, if you kind of fit things together, then you can get somewhere. And this leads to a proliferation of numbers. Some of them are official, others are not official. You constantly have to renegotiate. So these numbers are about people in needs, but they are also very needy themselves. They require a lot of relational work to constantly be remade. And I think, therefore, that we shouldn't actually think about these numbers as empirical, in terms of their empirical accuracy. I think it's more useful to look at them as moral claims on scarce resources and how these are distributed. And the fact that Joseph then has to put in a lot of extra work to make these type of distributions work. The second characteristic of governance had to do with committees. So I've shown you the big diagram of how basically from the president all the way to village level, there's a whole committee structure to deal with disasters. And this decentralized structure basically consists of volunteering citizens. So a lot of these citizens are not, they're not the state, but they help to instantiate the state nonetheless, because they are part of a formal state structure for which they're not paid. So they are overstretched and under-resourced in much the same way as civil servants are, which is really interesting because they're also mutually dependent. Joseph can't really do much unless the committee feeds him numbers, or unless he can call ahead and say, we're coming for a distribution, can you organize the people, can you make sure the lists are there? All of this legwork is being done by people who are not technically the state, but do labor in the name of the state after all. And Joseph then had to do a lot of caring for these committees, because he had to constantly call them, motivate them, solve disputes between different committees or between chiefs and committees. And he would often insist that they needed to be proactive. So he had all kinds of nice sayings of trying to motivate them. Payment for all their hard work would be in heaven, or that being proactive is a good citizen quality, and that we're all helping Malawi move forward. And I think part of his insistence on being proactive and on putting in the work without really seeing the fruits of your labor is probably because he didn't have actually anything to offer them. He would sometimes try and say, I'll connect you with an NGO that can come and do a training, then you can get an allowance for a few days of capacity building. But all these things were, empty promises in a way, and they could definitely not be done in the moment. But still, people found it important to be in these committees. And so I think I take issue here with a lot of the political science literature that has been written about Malawi and local governance. And so there I try and argue, bless you, I try and argue that these committees, even if they don't function the same on paper as in practice, or not at the same time, they do definitely exist, and they are a place in which the state is invoked. So it's definitely a place in which you can make claims on resources and make obligations that the state has visible, regardless of whether they can then materially follow up on these. And that kind of brings me to the third and final kind of element of disaster governance that is also very prominent in general governance in Malawi, which is basically these collaborations between state and non-state actors. And I think what we see here is kind of a renegotiation of sovereign responsibilities. And here I build on the work of Hannah Brown, who worked on Kenya. So there's one example where in the very first District Civil Protection Committee meeting, which happened the day after Joseph picked me up, as I described at the beginning of the talk, Joseph was chairing this meeting and trying to say, okay, guys, you know, we have this cyclone coming in. What are we going to do? And nobody was really coming forward. No, none of the NGOs were pledging funding. And then Joseph at some point said, well, we're all government, right? Like we have to act. So he was trying to get the committee to do something. And then Mary, who was the district leader for Red Cross, said, well, Joseph, you know, if we're all government, you are very government. So she was really trying to push this sovereign responsibility back on him, but he didn't really want to take it because he didn't have any resources to then actually make decisions. So he told me later on as well, he said, well, I have to make sure we're all on the same page. I can't go and direct people. I need to wait and see what they want to do. And this type of uneasy collaboration is really at the center of many of these collaborations. Another day, this day of the food distribution, there had been a donation of rice. So we were distributing rice, and in the speech here, this rice had been donated by the Chinese government. And in the speech to the community, Joseph made a big deal out of saying, let's put the quote over there. He made a big deal out of saying, well, you guys being the citizens, you guys don't always differentiate between, you know, the government or the NGOs, but basically it's all us. It's all the government. Because it's not like these organizations just get lost. We send them to you. We are the ones who send them to you. We know exactly where you are. We are the in-betweens, kind of. So if they come and they distribute things, it's basically us doing that. And of course, the representative from this NGO was not thrilled at this display of sovereignty, but it is the kind of statement that is also reminiscent of, for the historians among us, the time of Kamuzu Banda, Zonse di Boma, everything is the state. You know, we are projecting our omnipresence, even if we're not actually materially omnipresent. And this then leads to a feeling of being outshined. So on the one hand, Joseph wants to claim visibility and spotlight, but he's also constantly, even in doing so, completely outshined because everybody knows he doesn't actually have rice from China. The rice comes from China. That's on the box. And so he would often say things like, well, you know, in terms of resources, it seems like they, our partners, are shining, but they have only been channeled through them. They're our resources because we got them for disaster relief. Not entirely correct, but also not entirely wrong because, you know, they are a sovereign state. And he was also often very frustrated that if things were going well, the NGOs were at the forefront and they would claim a lot of involvement. But when things would go wrong, they would take a step back and point at the sovereign state, making the state look bad. And they devised a kind of idiom for this. So civil servants among themselves would speak about stealing shine, kubeya shine. And these were basically accusations of feeling that somebody claims more credit than what is actually due. So understanding that credit where credit is due, and those who pay, those who have credit, obviously also take it. But in this case, that provides a kind of productive tension between, on the one hand, feeling outshined, and on the other hand, also knowing they can't live up to their own obligations if they don't have this material help from other actors. So I think this emphasizes really the relational nature of state making and the mutuality that is integral to these processes of claim making for both civil servants' pride in their own moral understanding of what they should be doing, as well as for this projection of the state. And that kind of brings me towards the end. In the wake of a disaster, districts are often flooded by NGOs, and there's a lot of people that come in for these kind of interventions, but their assistance is really only temporary. So it's not like they stay, and civil servants are always there before the disaster, but also still after. So I've put a quote here from one civil servant who said, well, you know, this NGO just comes once, they get tired, then they go and rest. Another organization comes once, it gets tired, it goes and rests. But us, we continue, we're always here. And they would be working in, so this is a picture of the district office. Clearly it doesn't have electricity. Cyclone Idai also affected it at the time. Working from this office was really hard. There was no electricity, people had to pay for a generator out of pocket. They were trying to sort electricity faults. There was no printer. There were all kinds of problems. And they would often say things like, we are only working here because we are government. You know, like no NGO would let their people work in an office like this. Or we are Malawians, so we are working in makeshift offices to serve the people. And I think what this also kind of shows is that I don't think the NGOs in Geneva know that this is the type of circumstances under which Excel sheets have to be somehow created and sent on. And it shows also how these civil servants are kind of invisible in the bigger workings of these disaster relief interventions, when they are also really doing much of the legwork and really where the rubber hits the road. Without them, the international system can't latch on to anything on the ground. And towards the end of the response to Cyclone Idai, Joseph started falling ill. He was getting annoyed, he couldn't visit his family, he hadn't seen them for months. And he started saying things like, I have so many things to do, it is reaching the point where it is disrupting my personal life. He had to interrupt his studies, he was studying for his bachelor's. And he had been scrambling for resources and coordinating the response at district level, basically 24/7 for weeks on end, receiving as many non-state visitor delegations as possible, attending as many meetings as he could. And in the meantime, he had barely slept, and his phone was just blowing up with bad news, calls for help, pleas for assistance, and pictures or videos as proof of the fact that people needed this help. So he took note of all this, he recorded it in files and lists, all the while knowing that he wouldn't be able to take these files or lists anywhere, because it's not like people would still make funding available. He would be unable, basically, to help most of them. And therefore, I think that in all three of these kind of technologies of governance, if you want to think about it in a Foucauldian way, otherwise, all three of these types or characteristics of governing, we can kind of see that there is a lot of invisible work that civil servants have to put in to make them work. So for disaster data, which I look at more as moral claims, these numbers are needy. They're not just out there where you can pick them up and send them on. You have to make them. And the ones making them are the civil servants. The decentralized committees as well. On paper, it looks like there's a streamlined system, but to actually get the system to function, it's the civil servant who has to call, try and sweet talk people, make sure things actually work out. It is caring for committees to actually make them function. And in these collaborations as well, even though civil servants are dependent on these collaborations, they also have to somehow lead them, and they're outshined by them, but if they don't do it, then they also don't fulfill their obligations. So this is obviously a kind of moral balancing act. And I think if you put all this together, you can really see this kind of sense of duty shine through. And without it, or without taking it into account, I think we really miss a very important element of how civil servants manage to instantiate a state in any context, but I'm specifically talking about Malawi here, day after day, because this is also not something you can just do a little bit on the side. So in that sense, in conclusion, I think disasters really expose and reveal that civil servants are moral actors and that they do a lot more work than we give them credit for. So seeing the state in relief, which is what I try and do in my work, provides a really powerful counter-narrative to civil servants as ignorant or indifferent, incapable, or in the way. I've gone a bit big on the alliteration with I think, but it really showcases that work done despite appearing incompetent or irrelevant, because they don't get much credit for this at all. In fact, if something goes wrong, they're the first ones to be told off. But in doing all of this work, they are managing to make the state both, even though it might be insignificant in some instances, at the same time, it's indispensable. And I think that means I want to leave you with a kind of last thing to maybe ponder about, to which I don't have an answer, but to which I think we'll need to find an answer real soon, is the fact that this mismatch between resources and responsibility, or between responsibility and a state's responsibility, actually raises a lot of uncomfortable questions about planetary problems and state-centric conceptualizations of responsibility when disasters hit, or in Anthropocenic times. And so in these presentations, I've really tried to grapple with how a donor-dependent and disaster-prone state is both marginal and central. And even though it initially may appear incompetent, irrelevant, or ill-equipped, at the same time, the declaration of a state of disaster underlines its inability to care for its citizens, while it also underlines its sovereignty, because it's a sovereign act to declare you need help to then help your citizens. So it is in declaring a state of disaster that it invites non-state actors and their resources into the country to create space for relief interventions to take place. And these interventions are largely financed and implemented by non-state and humanitarian actors, but they do so in official collaboration with the state. And the state performs crucial tasks also to facilitate and enable this. Often eclipsed by this larger humanitarian apparatus, the DODMA and civil servants officially have and practically also actively take the responsibility to coordinate these interventions, even though they really struggle to do so satisfactorily, also according to their own standards. So this is not an external gaze in that sense. Moreover, although the interventions represent a much needed influx in resources, state actors do not actually control or obtain the majority of these resources because they're channeled through all these consortia of NGOs. And so despite its profound lack of resources and ostensible incapacity, the Malawi state remains central. And this is a, I think, powerful counter-argument to more Afro-pessimist ways of thinking about the state. But it also really means that we need to think about including a sense of duty in how we think and theorize about civil servants. So if we kind of say, well, you know, their personal motivations or their professional ethos is not important for our analysis of what they do, then I think we miss out on a lot. And the current predicament really, I think, should prompt us to ask, okay, why is Malawi so much more vulnerable to the impact of climate change effects, as these simultaneously render the Malawi state less able to protect its citizens and to effectively engage in disaster risk reduction? So you get this kind of narrative of blaming the climate for disasters. You know, disaster happens and then everybody, including Malawian civil servants, will say, oh, it's climate change. But really, these are, you know, political processes. Choices are being made that render some vulnerable and others comfortably resilient. And it's really ironic then, I do kind of want to celebrate this sense of duty because I think, you know, this is also credit where credit is due, but it's also really ironic to then be, or dangerous maybe even, to celebrate a state's reliance on an ultimately idiosyncratic sense of duty. And then also this work, this moral and invisible labor has to come from someone who is already in a super disadvantaged predicament when in a systemic way, we're not changing much about disaster relief interventions or how we think about climate change rules and regulations. And that sits really uneasily, I think, with some of the notions that many anthropologists, but also Africanists have been prompting lately, saying things like Africa is ahead of the curve. You know, they're experiencing already what climate change is. And I think in a really interesting article that Miriam recently pointed out to me, philosopher Michel Bastian really convincingly shows that it is this type of temporal reasoning that somewhere elsewhere, far away, they are already experiencing what might still come for us, is actually precisely the temporal structure that allows for these consequences to play out unimpeded. Conceptualizing climate change effects as materializing only sometime or already supports just business as usual. So in placing the emphasis in this talk on governance in times of disaster, I really want to try and premise the synchronous nature of climate change effects, which highlights that there's enduring inequities that create this situation that other people then have to solve. So I think that not just throws the state into relief, but also renders visible the fundamental injustice that Malawians are weathering through storms that for many of us only appear as some kind of distant dystopian future. Thank you.